The city of New York in the early 1920s was a sprawling, breathing beast of steel and steam, a place where millions of souls were packed into tenements and townhouses, all striving for a piece of the American dream. It was a time of noise, of jazz, of industry, and of immense crowds. In such a teeming hive of humanity, it was incredibly easy for a single man to disappear. It was easy for a ghost to walk among the living. And there was one man who mastered this art of invisibility better than anyone else. To look at him, you would see nothing but a gentle, frail old man. He had a soft, trembling voice, a drooping mustache that hid a small, weak mouth, and eyes that seemed permanently watery and sad. He looked like a grandfather, the kind of man you would hold a door open for, or perhaps offer your seat to on a crowded subway car. He was the man you would trust to watch your bag for a moment, or sadly, the man you would trust to speak to your children. He was known as the Gray Man, because he seemed to fade into the background of any room he entered, a color of nothingness, a smudge of smoke in the vibrant tapestry of the city. But beneath that harmless, gray exterior beat the heart of a creature so twisted, so devoid of human empathy, that he would eventually terrify an entire nation. His name was Hamilton Howard Fish, though he would use many names throughout his life. But names didn't matter to him as much as his hunger did. To understand the monster he became, one must look back into the shadows of his own history, into the cracks where the light of sanity had leaked out long ago. Born in Washington, D.C. in 1870, his life began in tragedy. His father died when he was young, and he was placed in an orphanage, a cold, unloving institution where discipline was dealt out with leather straps and heavy fists. It was there, in the dark corners of that orphanage, that the wires in young Hamilton's mind began to cross. He learned early on that pain was not something to run from, but something to embrace. He began to confuse suffering with pleasure, punishment with affection. The world to him was not a place of safety, but a playground of hurt, and he decided that if he was to survive, he would not be the victim. He would be the architect of the pain. As he grew older, this twisted philosophy festered. He drifted through life, a transient, a painter, a handyman, taking odd jobs that allowed him to move from town to town, never staying long enough for people to notice the strange glint in his eyes when he looked at something vulnerable. He married. He fathered children of his own, playing the role of the family man, yet the darkness inside him was growing like a cancer. His own children would later recall a father who was distant, strange, prone to bizarre outbursts and peculiar punishments. But to the outside world, he was just Albert, a quiet man, a religious man, even. He quoted the Bible with a fervor that unnerved those who listened closely, twisting verses to justify the dark urges that pulsed in his veins. He believed he was special. He believed he was chosen. He believed that the rules of God and man did not apply to him in the way they did to others. By the summer of 1924, Albert Fish was 54 years old. He was past his prime, his body beginning to wither, his hair thinning. To the casual observer, he was harmless. But inside, the hunger had become unbearable. It wasn't just a desire. It was a compulsion, a roaring fire that demanded to be fed. He began to wander the streets of New York, not with the aimlessness of the elderly, but with the predatory focus of a wolf. He watched. He waited. He looked for the moments when mothers turned their backs, when the noise of the city drowned out the small voices. He frequented parks, playgrounds, and the cramped, busy streets where children played stickball and tag. He would sit on a bench, a newspaper folded in his lap, his watery eyes scanning the playground, picking out the ones who looked lonely, the ones who looked trusting. He wasn't looking for a fight. He was looking for innocence. The gray man knew that his greatest weapon was his appearance. Who would suspect the nice old man with the candy in his pocket? Who would fear the frail gentleman who needed help finding his way? He perfected his mask. He learned to smile in a way that crinkled his eyes just so, to pitch his voice to a soothing, grandfatherly tremble. He was a spider weaving a web not of silk, but of trust. And the terrifying truth was that the fly never knew it was caught until it was far, far too late. The city moved around him, loud and chaotic, completely unaware that a monster was sitting on its park benches, breathing its air, and planning to take its most precious treasures. The stage was set. The hunger was peaking. And on a warm July day, the gray man decided it was time to stop watching and time to start hunting. The shadows were about to get much, much darker. The summer of 1924 was blistering. The heat in New York didn't just sit. It pressed down on you, a heavy, humid blanket that made the air shimmer above the asphalt. It was the kind of July where tempers flared easily, where windows were thrown open hoping for a non-existent breeze, and where children, freed from the confines of school, flooded the streets and the overgrown lots to escape the stifling apartments. In Staten Island, the air was a little cleaner, the spaces a little wider, but the heat was just as oppressive. On the 15th of July, 8-year-old Francis McDonald was out playing with his friends. They were doing what boys do, running, shouting, kicking up dust, completely absorbed in their own world of games and laughter. They felt safe. Why wouldn't they? This was their neighborhood, their territory. But safety is an illusion, a fragile glass pane that can shatter with the softest tap. And that tap came in the form of a shuffling, mumbling old man who had been watching them for quite some time. He stood by the edge of the wood, leaning slightly as if the heat were too much for his old bones. He didn't look like a threat. He looked like a discarded rag doll. He wore a suit that had seen better days, a hat pulled low to shield his eyes from the sun. The boys didn't stop playing when they saw him. To them, adults were just background noise, especially old ones. But this old man wasn't just passing by. He was hunting. He watched Francis, the way the boy moved, the way he laughed. He saw the life in him, vibrant and pure, and his own dark hunger spiked. He took a step forward, then another, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't grab. He didn't run. He simply spoke. His voice was a rasp, a dry whisper that sounded like dead leaves scraping together. He called out to the boys, asking for help. He mumbled something about a job, about needing strong young hands to help him move something, or perhaps to see something wonderful he had found in the woods. It was the oldest trick in the book, a lure as ancient as predators themselves. Francis, being a helpful boy, a good boy, didn't hesitate. He saw an elder in need. The other boys watched as Francis walked over to the man. They saw the man lean down, whispering something that made Francis nod. They saw the man place a hand on the boy's shoulder, not a grip of iron, but a guiding, almost gentle touch. And then they walked away, together, the old man and the young boy, disappearing into the thicket of trees that bordered the play area. The other children went back to their game. They didn't know they had just witnessed an abduction. They didn't know that the nice old man was walking Francis not to a job, but to his doom. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long, stretching shadows across the grass. The laughter died down as the boys started to head home for dinner. But Francis didn't return. Panic is a slow-rising tide. At first, it's just annoyance. Where is that boy? Then, it's concern. He's never this late. And finally, it crashes over you as terror. Francis's parents began to ask around. They went to the neighbors. They went to the friends. He went with the old man. The boys said, pointing toward the woods. The old man needed help. The blood drained from the parents' faces. A search party was formed immediately. Men with lanterns and flashlights combed through the underbrush, calling out Francis's name, their voices tight with fear. The woods, usually a place of adventure, now seemed menacing, every rustle of leaves sounding like a scream. Hours passed. The darkness was absolute. And then a shout. A terrible, gut-wrenching shout from deep in the woods. They found him. Francis McDonald's body was discovered in a secluded area, hidden away from the prying eyes of the world. He had been strangled. His life had been squeezed out of him by those same hands that had gently guided him away hours before. The brutality of the act was shocking. This wasn't an accident. This was a deliberate, violent extinguishing of a light. The police were baffled. Who would do such a thing? There were no enemies, no feuds. Just a random, senseless act of evil. The gray man had struck. He had walked into their lives, taken their son, and then simply vanished back into the city, leaving nothing behind but a corpse and a shattered family. The community was paralyzed. The realization hit them like a physical blow. The monster wasn't hiding under the bed. He was walking down the street in broad daylight, smiling at them. And he was gone. 3 years had passed since Francis McDonald was found in the woods, and the city's memory, usually short and fickle, had begun to fog over the details of the tragedy. But fear has a way of lingering in the cracks of the pavement, waiting for the sun to go down. It was 1927 now, and the setting shifted to Brooklyn. The borough was a labyrinth of brick tenements, narrow hallways, and stairwells that smelled of boiled cabbage and damp wool. It was a place where neighbors knew each other's business, where doors were often left unlocked, and where children played in the corridors when the streets were too cold or too dangerous. Among these children was 4-year-old Billy Gaffney. He was a small, fragile-looking boy, the kind who seemed to disappear inside his own clothes. But he had a bright, trusting smile. On a chilly February morning, Billy and his friend, a 3-year-old named Billy Beaton, were playing in the hallway of their apartment building. It was a mundane scene, the sound of small feet pattering on the wooden floorboards, the quiet murmur of their games echoing off the peeling wallpaper. But they were not alone. The hallway, usually a sanctuary of domestic life, had been breached. A shadow had slipped in through the front door, silent as smoke. A neighbor, a young man named Joseph Meehan, stepped out into the hall and froze. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his days, a nightmare image that he would struggle to articulate to the police. He saw an old man, but not just any old man. This figure was gray suit, gray hair, gray mustache, like a monochrome photograph cut out and pasted into the colorful world of the living. He looked ancient, his face a map of deep wrinkles, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of a battered fedora. He was crouching down, whispering to the boys. Meehan felt a primal shiver run down his spine, an instinctual warning that something was terribly, terribly wrong. The man didn't look like a grandfather. He looked like something that had crawled out of a dark fairy tale. He looked like the Boogeyman. Meehan watched, paralyzed by a strange mixture of confusion and dread, as the old man stood up. He took Billy Gaffney by the hand. It wasn't a violent snatch. It was a calm, possessive grip. The little boy didn't scream. He didn't cry out for his mother. He simply looked up at the gray figure, perhaps mesmerized by the soft, trembling voice that promised him something. Candy, a toy, a trip, to see something wonderful. And then they began to walk. The neighbor, shaking off his paralysis, shouted, "Who are you? Where are you going?" The old man didn't turn. He didn't speed up. He just kept walking, pulling Billy Gaffney into the shadows of the stairwell, down towards the street, and into the abyss. The heavy door clicked shut behind them, sealing the hallway in silence once more. The only thing left was the other little boy, Billy Beaton, standing alone, confused, staring at the empty space where his friend had been just seconds before. The panic that followed was immediate and hysterical. Billy's mother, alerted by the neighbor, ran into the street, screaming her son's name. The police were called, and the neighborhood erupted into a frenzy of searching. They checked the rooftops, the basements, the coal chutes. They pried open manhole covers and peered into the black, rushing water of the sewers. They tore apart the building, room by room, desperate to find the little boy. But Billy Gaffney was gone. It was as if the earth had opened up and swallowed him whole. The description given by Joseph Meehan, the Boogeyman, became the stuff of local legend. A man with a gray mustache, a man who looked like a derelict, a man who could walk into a building and steal a child from right under their noses. The police dragged the rivers. They questioned every vagrant and eccentric in Brooklyn. But the gray man was a ghost. He had no address, no job, no pattern that they could discern. He was a phantom who drifted between the boroughs, living in cheap rooming houses, changing his name as easily as he changed his socks. While the Gaffney family wept and prayed, Albert Fish was already miles away, blending back into the anonymous crowds of the city. He had taken Billy, and the fate of that little boy would remain a horrific mystery for years, a dark secret locked inside the mind of a madman. The Boogeyman wasn't a story to scare children into behaving. He was real. He was flesh and blood, and he was still hungry. The city held its breath, waiting for the next shoe to drop, unaware that the worst was yet to come. The shadows in the hallways seemed to stretch longer, and every creak of a floorboard sounded like the footsteps of the gray monster returning for another meal. It was the spring of 1928, a time when hope was a commodity as precious as gold in the working-class neighborhoods of New York. In the Budd household, a small, cramped apartment on West 15th Street, that hope had taken the form of a newspaper advertisement. Edward Budd, an 18-year-old boy eager to help his struggling family, had placed a simple ad in the New York World looking for work. He was a good boy, earnest and willing, and he waited with bated breath for a reply. On Sunday, May 27th, a knock came at the door. It wasn't the aggressive pound of a debt collector or the raucous banging of a neighbor. It was a gentle, almost polite tap. When Edward opened the door, he didn't find a businessman or a factory foreman. He found a little old man. The stranger introduced himself as Frank Howard. He was small, with stooped shoulders and a mustache that drooped over a mouth that seemed too small for his face. He held his hat in his hands, his fingers working the brim nervously, his eyes watering as if the city air was too harsh for him. He looked like a grandfather from a storybook, harmless, frail, perhaps a bit lonely. He told Edward and his parents, Albert and Delia Budd, that he was a farmer from Farmingdale, Long Island. He spoke of a quiet life, of green fields and fresh air, and he said he needed a strong young man like Edward to help him on the farm. The pay he offered was generous, far better than anything Edward could find in the city factories. It sounded like a dream come true. Mrs. Budd, a hard-working woman who wanted nothing but the best for her children, was immediately charmed. How could she not be? Frank Howard was soft-spoken and polite. He didn't have the rough edges of the city men. He sat in their modest living room, sipping tea, and spun tales of his farm. He talked about his cows, his chickens, the strawberries that grew wild in the fields. He painted a picture of an idyllic life that felt a world away from the soot and noise of Manhattan. He was a mesmerizing storyteller, his voice a low, hypnotic drone that made you want to lean in and listen. He asked about the family, showing a keen, kindly interest in their lives. He wasn't just an employer, he felt like a friend. And then the room shifted. A door opened, and into the living room walked Grace. She was 10 years old, a bright, bubbly girl with a face full of innocence and light. She had been playing outside, her cheeks flushed, her hair slightly mussed. She stopped when she saw the stranger, offering a shy smile. The old man's conversation didn't stop, but the air in the room seemed to freeze for a microsecond. His watery eyes, which had been fixed on Edward and the parents, slowly drifted to the girl. It was a subtle movement, barely noticeable, like a lizard shifting its gaze. He smiled at her, a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes and exposed his teeth. "And who is this little flower?" he asked, his voice dropping an octave, becoming even softer, even sweeter. "This is Grace," Mrs. Budd said proudly, oblivious to the predator sitting on her sofa. "She's our angel." Frank Howard beamed. He called her over, reaching into his pocket to offer her a few pennies or perhaps a piece of hard candy. He told her she was a pretty girl, a very pretty girl. The parents watched with smiles on their faces, thinking how lucky they were to have met such a nice old gentleman who loved children so much. They didn't see the hunger behind the rheumy eyes. They didn't see the calculation. They didn't know that the farm in Farmingdale was a lie, or that Frank Howard was a mask worn by a monster named Albert Fish. To them, he was a savior offering their son a future. To him, they were sheep offering up a lamb. He stayed for lunch. He broke bread with them. He ate their food, laughed at their jokes, and complimented Mrs. Budd on her cooking. He became part of the family in the span of an afternoon. He watched Grace eat, watched her move, watched the pulse in her neck. He was patient. He was thorough. He knew he had them. He knew that they trusted him implicitly now. As the afternoon wore on, he prepared to leave, promising to return the following Sunday to take Edward to the farm. But as he stood at the door, putting on his hat, his eyes lingered one last time on Grace. He had a new plan forming in his twisted mind, a plan far darker than just hiring a farmhand. He had seen the prize, and he knew exactly how he was going to take it. The trap was set, not with iron bars, but with kindness and a smile. Sunday, June 3rd, 1928. The sun rose over New York with a lazy, golden warmth, promising a beautiful day. In the Budd household, the mood was light, expectant. They were waiting for Mr. Frank Howard to return to finalize the plans for Edward's job on the farm. And true to his word, just as the church bells were finishing their morning toll, a knock came at the door. There he stood, the kindly old grandfather from Farmingdale, dressed in his Sunday best, clutching a small bouquet of flowers and a pot of cottage cheese as gifts for Mrs. Budd. He was the picture of benevolence, a sweet old soul who seemed to radiate kindness. He sat down, drank his tea, and chatted amicably with the family, his watery eyes crinkling with every smile. But there was a new proposition on his lips today, a little detour before the business of the farm could begin. "I'm going to a birthday party uptown," he announced, his voice soft and trembling with excitement. "It's for my sister's children. There's going to be cake, ice cream, games, a real celebration." He paused, letting the image of the party hang in the air, sweet and tempting. Then he turned, his gaze to Grace. The little girl was listening, her eyes wide. "I was wondering," he continued, looking back at the parents, "if you would allow little Grace to accompany me? She would have such a wonderful time with the other children. It's a shame for a pretty girl to be cooped up inside on such a lovely day." The room went quiet for a moment. Mrs. Budd hesitated. It was one thing to send her 18-year-old son off to work. It was another to send her 10-year-old daughter off with a man they had only met once before. But Mr. Howard was so insistent, so gentle. "I will bring her back early," he promised, his hand over his heart. "Before dark. I wouldn't want you to worry." He spoke of the party favors, the fun she would have, the other little girls she would meet. Grace looked at her mother, her face beaming with hope. A party, cake and ice cream. It was a rare treat for a child in their financial situation. The hesitation in Mrs. Budd's heart began to melt under the heat of Grace's excitement and the old man's reassurances. He was a grandfather, after all. What harm could there be? Finally, Mrs. Budd smiled and nodded. "All right," she said, "but be back before supper." Grace let out a squeal of delight and ran to get changed. She put on her best white dress, the one she saved for church and special occasions. She tied a ribbon in her hair. She looked like a little angel, pure and full of life. When she emerged, Mr. Howard's eyes lit up, a flicker of something dark passing through them so quickly that no one noticed. "You look beautiful, my dear," he whispered. "Just beautiful." The goodbye was casual, almost an afterthought. Edward walked them to the street. The neighbors were out on their stoops, enjoying the Sunday air. They saw the nice old man holding the little girl's hand. They saw Grace skipping slightly, unable to contain her joy. Mr. Howard tipped his hat to the neighbors, a perfect gentleman. Edward waved as they turned the corner toward the subway station. "Be good, Grace," he called out. She turned and waved back, her smile bright as the sun. That was the last time Edward would ever see his sister's smile. They descended into the subway, the cool, damp air swallowing them up. The train rattled into the station, a metal beast screeching on the tracks. They boarded, finding seats near the window. As the train lurched forward, leaving the safety of the Budds' neighborhood behind, the landscape began to change. The city blurred past the windows, a smear of gray and brick. Grace chatted happily about the party, asking about the games and the cake. Mr. Howard nodded and smiled, answering her questions in his soft, rasping voice. But as the train rumbled on, carrying them further and further away from the city center, into the quieter, more desolate stretches of Westchester, the grandfather mask began to slip, just a fraction. He wasn't taking her to a party uptown. He was taking her into the void. The train wheels clicked a rhythmic beat on the tracks, a countdown to a horror that Grace could never have imagined. She was alone now, truly alone, with the gray man. And the darkness was closing in. The train ride ended not at a bustling party venue, but at a quiet, dusty station in Westchester. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long shadows that stretched like skeletal fingers across the ground. Grace Budd, clutching her small purse, stepped onto the platform, looking around for the balloons, the other children, the signs of a celebration. But there was only silence. The air here smelled of damp earth and rotting leaves, a stark contrast to the city smoke she was used to. "Where is the party, Mr. Howard?" she asked, her voice small in the vast emptiness. Albert Fish, the man she knew as a kindly grandfather, smiled down at her. "It's just a little walk, my dear. Just a little walk to the house. Everyone is waiting for us." They walked. The path wound away from the station, away from the few houses that dotted the landscape, and into the woods. The trees grew thicker here, their branches intertwining overhead to block out the dying light. The birds seemed to have stopped singing, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Grace's white dress, so bright and cheerful when she left her mother's arms, now seemed like a beacon in the gloom. She began to feel a prickle of unease. The walk was taking too long. Her feet hurt in her Sunday shoes. "Mr. Howard, are we almost there?" she asked again, a tremor in her voice. Fish didn't answer immediately. He just kept walking, his pace steady, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. Finally, he pointed a gnarled finger. "There," he rasped. "Wisteria Cottage." The house emerged from the trees like a tombstone. It was an abandoned, dilapidated structure, its windows dark and staring like empty eye sockets. There were no streamers, no music, no children playing tag on the lawn, just a rotting porch and a door that hung slightly ajar, swaying in the breeze. Grace stopped. The instinct that warns prey of a predator screamed in her mind. This isn't a party house," she whispered, backing away. Fish turned to her then. The mask of the kindly old man dissolved. The smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold, dead purpose. His eyes, usually watery and vague, were now sharp and focused, glittering with a terrible anticipation. "The party is inside, Grace," he said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly low growl. "You are the guest of honor." He ushered her up the steps. The wood creaked under their weight, a groan of protest from the dying house. Inside, it was dark. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that cut through the boarded windows. The air was stale, heavy with the smell of old wood and something else, something metallic. "Wait here," Fish commanded, pushing her into a small room. "I have a game for us to play." Grace stood there, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She heard him moving in the other room. The sound of metal clinking against metal. A drawer opening. A heavy, wet thud. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream for her mother. But fear froze her feet to the floor. She was a statue of terror in a white dress. When he returned, he wasn't holding cake. He wasn't holding a present. He was holding the tools of his trade. The game was revealed. The horror of her situation crashed down on her with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a party. This was a slaughterhouse. Grace opened her mouth to scream, but before the sound could escape, the gray man was upon her. He moved with a speed that defied his age, a frenzy born of decades of suppressed hunger. His hands, strong and cold, clamped around her throat. The struggle was brief. The innocence of childhood was extinguished in a violent, chaotic flurry of motion in that dusty room. The silence returned to Wisteria Cottage, heavier than before. Outside, the sun finally set, plunging the world into darkness. But inside, the darkness was already absolute. Albert Fish stood over the small, still form, the hunger in his eyes finally replaced by a chilling satisfaction. The party was over. The feast was about to begin. The silence that followed Grace Budd's disappearance was not a peaceful quiet. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that descended upon the Budd household and refused to lift. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and months dragged painfully into years. Edward Budd, the brother who had walked her to the street, the boy who had unknowingly handed his little sister to a monster, lived in a personal hell of guilt and what-ifs. Every knock at the door made his heart leap. Every time the phone rang, the air in the apartment grew thin. But it was never Grace. It was never the police with good news. Frank Howard, they knew, had evaporated like mist. Detectives scoured Farmingdale, Long Island. They questioned farmers, checked deed records, and walked the fields looking for a man who matched the description. But there was no Frank Howard. There was no farm. The address was a phantom location, a cruel lie constructed solely to entrap a child. The police were baffled. They had a description, a frail, gray old man with a drooping mustache. But in a city of millions, that description fit thousands. The case of Grace Budd grew cold, filed away in the dusty cabinets of the impossible, a tragedy without an ending. While the Budd family withered in their grief, shrinking under the weight of the unknown, Albert Fish continued to exist in the margins of society, a ghost haunting the very city he preyed upon. He didn't flee the country. He didn't go into deep hiding. He simply shed the skin of Frank Howard and returned to being Albert. He took odd jobs, painting houses, installing wallpaper, drifting from one cheap boarding house to another. To his landladies and neighbors, he was just an eccentric old man, perhaps a bit strange in his religious rantings, but ultimately harmless. They saw a man who read the Bible for hours, muttering verses about atonement and sacrifice. They didn't see the monster who had cooked and eaten a child in a derelict cottage. They didn't see the darkness that swirled behind his watery eyes. But the darkness wasn't just directed outward. It turned inward with a ferocious intensity. Fish was not merely a sadist. He was a masochist of the highest order. He believed in a twisted form of purification through pain, a philosophy he had been honing since the orphanage. In the privacy of his rented rooms, with the curtains drawn tight against the world, he engaged in rituals of self-torture that would make a sane man retch. He would beat himself with a paddle studded with nails until blood ran down his back, chanting prayers as the iron bit into his flesh. He would burn himself with wool soaked in alcohol. But his most horrific secret, one that would stay hidden until the very end, lay deep within his own body. Over the years, driven by a madness that defied medical explanation, Fish began to insert sewing needles into his own groin and pelvic area. He would push them in, one by one, feeling the sharp sting of the metal sliding through muscle and tissue until they disappeared completely beneath his skin. He didn't do this for punishment. He did it for pleasure. He did it to feel something in a world that felt dead to him. He walked around with dozens of these steel needles embedded in his body, a human pincushion of his own making, smiling at neighbors while jagged metal rusted inside him. 6 years passed. The world changed. The roaring 20s crashed into the Great Depression. The optimism of the Jazz Age was replaced by breadlines and despair. The Budd family moved, trying to leave the ghosts behind, but you cannot move away from a hole in your heart. Grace would have been 16 now, a young woman. Edward was a man, hardened by regret. The police had long since stopped actively searching for Frank Howard. The file was closed, gathering dust. The city had moved on, but Albert Fish had not. The memory of that day in Westchester, The taste of the party was still fresh in his mind. It was a golden memory he revisited often. And as his mind deteriorated further, as the syphilis that likely racked his brain began to eat away at his last shreds of caution, a new urge began to rise. It wasn't enough to have done the deed. He needed them to know. He needed the mother to know. The silence of the Budd family was no longer satisfying to him. He wanted to twist the knife one last time. He wanted to reclaim his power. The hunger for flesh had been sated, but the hunger for their pain was roaring back to life. The year was 1934. The Great Depression had settled into the bones of America, a gray fog of poverty and desperation that matched the color of the man who had stolen Grace Budd 6 years earlier. The Budd family, though scarred, was still standing. Life, with its cruel insistence, had marched on. Edward was older now, a man of 24, but the shadow of his little sister still lingered in the corners of his eyes. Mrs. Budd had aged, her hair turning white, her face etched with the permanent lines of a mother who never got to say goodbye. They had moved to a new apartment on West 15th Street, trying to leave the ghosts behind, trying to forget the kindly old farmer who had promised strawberries and cream. They thought the worst was over. They thought the silence was the end of the horror. They were wrong. On a cold November morning, a letter arrived. It was an ordinary envelope, cheap and thin, the kind you could buy at any corner store for a penny. It was addressed to Mrs. Budd. The handwriting was jagged, spidery, the ink slightly smeared as if the writer's hand had trembled with excitement, or perhaps madness. There was no return address, just a postmark from New York City. Mrs. Budd picked it up from the hall table, her hands shaking slightly. Who would be writing to her? A bill collector? A distant relative? She tore open the flap, pulling out several sheets of lined paper covered in that same frantic scrawl. She began to read, and with every word, the blood drained further from her face until she looked like a wax figure. The letter didn't start with a confession. It started with a story, a bizarre, rambling tale about a famine in China back in the 1890s. The writer spoke of starving children, of flesh being sold in the markets like pork, of the desperation that drove men to eat their own kind. It was a history lesson from hell, delivered by a madman. Children under 12 were sold for food. The letter read, the words jumping off the page with a sickening casualness. Mrs. Budd's eyes raced over the lines, confusion warring with a rising nausea. Why was someone sending her this? What did Chinese famines have to do with her? And then, the letter shifted. The history lesson ended, and the nightmare began. The tone changed from detached observer to intimate participant. I like children tasty. The letter continued. The handwriting seemed to press harder into the paper here. I made up my mind to eat a child. The world around Mrs. Budd dissolved. The noise of the street outside, the ticking of the clock, it all vanished. There was only the voice of the letter, whispering directly into her ear. The writer described meeting a boy on the street, but the boy was too big. Then, he described meeting a girl named Grace. I called on you, the letter said. We had lunch. I told you I was a farmer. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. It was him. It was Frank Howard. The monster had not forgotten them. He had been waiting. He had been savoring the memory for 6 long years, and now he was serving it to her on a platter of paper and ink. He described the train ride. He described the walk to the empty house in Westchester. He recounted, with a chilling lack of emotion, how Grace had picked flowers on the way, how she had trusted him until the very end. And then he described the act itself. He told the mother exactly how her daughter died. He assured her, in a twisted attempt at comfort, that Grace had not suffered long, that she had died a good girl, a virgin. But then came the details that would shatter a mother's mind forever. He described stripping her small body. He described cutting her up. He described cooking her flesh, steaks, chops, a stew, and eating her over the course of 9 days. He described how sweet her meat was, tender and soft. He claimed he had never tasted anything so delicious in his life. He ended the letter not with an apology, not with remorse, but with a simple, horrifying sign-off, a final taunt from the abyss. Mrs. Budd dropped the letter. Her scream was not human. It was the sound of a soul breaking. Edward rushed into the room, finding his mother collapsing, the pages scattered on the floor like fallen leaves. He picked one up, his eyes scanning the words that had destroyed her. "I ate her." The police were called immediately, but this time there was no vague description. This time, the monster had made a mistake. In his arrogance, in his need to boast, he had given them a piece of himself. The letter wasn't just a torture device, it was evidence. The police handled the paper with gloves, their faces grim. This wasn't a cold case anymore. The gray man had reached out from the darkness, and in doing so, he had stepped into the light. The hunt was back on. The letter lay on the desk of Detective Will King, a man who had seen the darkest corners of the city, yet found himself trembling at the sight of those jagged, spidery scrawls. To the Budd family, the letter was a weapon of psychological destruction, a final twist of the knife from a demon. But to Detective King, it was something else entirely. It was a mistake. For 6 years, the gray man had been a phantom, a wisp of smoke that vanished the moment you tried to grasp it. He had left no fingerprints, no witnesses, no trace evidence at the crumbling Wisteria cottage. He had been perfect in his invisibility. But arrogance is the flaw of every monster, and in his overwhelming need to brag, to relive the horror, Albert Fish had handed the police the very thread that would unravel him. King didn't focus on the gruesome descriptions of the stew or the taunts about Grace's suffering. He focused on the paper itself. He turned the envelope over in his hands, examining it under the stark glare of the precinct lamp. It was cheap, standard stationery, the kind found in 1,000 dime stores across New York. But there was something on the back flap, a detail so small that a lesser detective might have missed it entirely. Embossed in the corner was a tiny emblem, a logo for the NYPCBA, the New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. It was a lifeline thrown into a sea of hopelessness. The police didn't have a name, but they had a location. They had a source. King grabbed his coat and hat, his heart, hammering a rhythm of grim determination against his ribs. The hunt had shifted gears. The predator was about to become the prey. King arrived at the association's headquarters, a dusty office filled with the smell of stale tobacco and old ledger books. He showed the envelope to the man in charge, his voice tight with urgency. "Who uses this stationery?" he demanded. The man squinted at the envelope, scratching his chin. "We keep a stack of these in the lobby for the members," he said slowly. Anyone could have taken a few. King's hope faltered for a second, but he pressed on. "Think. Has anyone strange been here? Someone who doesn't fit? An old man, perhaps." The man's eyes widened slightly. The memory surfaced from the murk of mundane days. "Yeah," he muttered. "A few weeks back. An old guy. Looked like a vagrant, almost. He came in asking about a job. Said he used to be a painter. While he was waiting, I saw him grab a handful of envelopes from the desk. Stuff them in his pocket like he was stealing gold." Did he give a name? King asked, the air in the room suddenly electric. Fish, the man replied. Albert Fish. The name hung in the air, heavy and solid. Albert Fish. It wasn't Frank Howard. It wasn't a phantom. It was a real name. King wasted no time. He dug into the association's records, finding an application form filled out by the same hand that had written the letter to Mrs. Budd. The address listed was a rooming house on East 52nd Street. King moved with the speed of a man possessed. He gathered a small team, men with hard faces and heavy coats, and they descended on the address like wolves. The building was a tenement, a hive of transient souls and broken dreams. King found the landlady, a stout woman who looked tired of life. He showed her a mugshot from an old arrest record they had dug up, a younger Fish, but the eyes were the same. He lives here, she confirmed, wiping her hands on her apron. Room on the 3rd floor. But he ain't home. He comes and goes at odd hours. Strange old bird, always mumbling to himself. King nodded, signaling his men to take positions. They didn't kick down the door. They didn't rush in with guns blazing. They waited. They became the shadows in the hallway, the silent watchers in the dark. King sat on a wooden chair at the end of the corridor, a lit cigarette burning slowly between his fingers, the smoke curling up into the stagnant air. He watched the stairs. He listened to the creaks and groans of the building. Hours ticked by. The sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the peeling wallpaper. And then a sound. The front door opened downstairs. Footsteps. Slow, shuffling footsteps. The sound of an old man navigating the stairs, one heavy step at a time. King stubbed out his cigarette, his hand drifting to the revolver at his hip. The footsteps grew louder, closer. A shadow detached itself from the gloom of the stairwell. A gray hat, a gray suit, a gray mustache. Albert Fish reached the landing, pausing to catch his breath, his watery eyes scanning the hallway. He didn't see the trap until it was sprung. He didn't see the law waiting for him in the dim light. He just stood there, a frail, trembling figure carrying a bag of groceries, completely unaware that the ghost of Grace Budd had finally caught up with him. King stood up, his badge glinting in the half-light. "Albert Fish?" he asked, his voice calm, cold, and final. The old man looked up, and for the first time in 6 years, the gray man looked surprised. Detective Will King didn't have to drag the truth out of Albert Fish. He didn't have to use bright lights or rubber hoses. In the interrogation room, the gray man sat calmly, his hands folded in his lap like a penitent schoolboy, and simply opened the floodgates of his own hell. He didn't just confess, he bragged. He spoke of Grace Budd not as a victim, but as a meal, detailing the culinary process with a sickening, lip-smacking precision that made seasoned. Officers retch into wastebaskets. He told them about the pot roast. He told them about the stew. He spoke of the sweetness of her flesh. But he didn't stop at Grace. He began to list others, Francis McDonnell, Billy Gaffney, and a litany of names that had been lost to time. He claimed to have molested over 400 children and murdered perhaps 100. "I had children in every state," he boasted, his voice a soft, proud rasps, his eyes gleaming with the memory of their screams. He was a grandfatherly figure recounting a picnic, only the picnic was a slaughter. The trial of Albert Fish in 1935 was less a legal proceeding and more a descent into madness. The courtroom in White Plains was packed to the rafters, men and women jostling to catch a glimpse of the werewolf of Wisteria. They expected a raving lunatic, a beast frothing at the mouth. Instead, they saw a frail, 65-year-old man who looked like he should be feeding pigeons in the park. His defense attorney, James Dempsey, tried to save him from the chair by pleading insanity. He argued that no sane man could do what Fish did. He painted a picture of a mind so broken by religious mania and sadism that it couldn't distinguish right from wrong. To prove this, he introduced a piece of evidence that would become the stuff of nightmares: the X-rays. The courtroom fell into a stunned, horrified silence as the black and white images were displayed. There, clearly visible in the pelvic region of this harmless old man, was a constellation of white streaks. Needles, 29 of them. Fish had been inserting them into his own groin for years, pushing them deep into the muscle until they vanished, simply to feel the pleasure of the pain. He was a walking pincushion of steel and infection. The jury stared, mouths agape. This wasn't just a killer. This was a creature from another dimension of suffering. But the prosecution was relentless. They argued that Fish knew exactly what he was doing. He had hidden the bodies. He had written the letter. He had used aliases. He was calculated. He was evil, not crazy. The jury agreed. It took them less than an hour to return with a verdict: guilty. The sentence was death. On January 16, 1936, Albert Fish walked into the execution chamber at Sing Sing prison. He didn't drag his feet. He didn't beg for mercy. He walked with a bounce in his step, a disturbing eagerness that unsettled even the executioner, Robert Elliott. Fish was dressed in his own clothes, his gray hair combed, his eyes bright. As they strapped him into Old Sparky, the legendary electric chair that had claimed so many lives, he helped the guards with the buckles on his legs. He was helpful to the very end. When asked if he had any final words, he reportedly looked at the chair, then at the witnesses, and whispered, "I don't even know why I'm here." But to others, he had confided something far darker days before. "What a thrill that will be if I have to die in the electric chair. It will be the supreme thrill. The only one I haven't tried." The heavy leather mask was lowered over his face, hiding the grandfatherly features for the last time. The electrode was attached to his leg, right over the scars where the needles still rusted inside him. The switch was thrown. 2,000 volts of electricity surged through the gray man's body. His fists clenched, his body arched against the straps, and smoke began to curl up from the electrodes. The room filled with the smell of burning flesh, a final, ironic end for a cannibal. They hit him with a second jolt, just to be sure. And then, the doctor stepped forward, placed a stethoscope to the chest, and pronounced him dead. The boogeyman was gone. But the story of the nice old man who walked children into the woods, the story of the needles and the letter, would linger like a stain on the American psyche forever. The darkness had been burned out of him, but the shadow he cast would never truly fade.